Welcome. I am Diane Freeman, Managing Director of Voyager Capital, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to next in our series of Voyager Explores Conversations. And today we're going to be diving into what has got to be the ultimate in-the-moment discussion, preparing for the hybrid workplace. I'm pleased to be joined by two experts to help in the conversation: Julie Lucht, partner in Perkins Coie's Labor and Environment Group, and Spencer Levy, Chairman of America's Research and the Senior Economic Advisor for CBRE. So I'm sure that all of you are thinking about or may have already addressed return to work processes, strategies, policies, or some of you may be sticking with remote as your preferred operating approach. But it's clear that either way, the ongoing challenges and opportunities in how and where work gets done is going to affect scaling your revenue, your culture, and maintaining a safe workplace. So the decisions that you are going to make now will affect workforce, and workplace. And it's complicated. It's a laboratory of learning. Each workplace is unique and require a unique solution. So let's jump in with our experts and see what we can all learn. And feel free to use the chat link in this on the bottom there for any questions that you may have throughout the conversation. We'll try and get to all of them as we go. So Spencer, let me start with you. Good morning.
Good morning.
Asking the high level question of, what are you seeing in the state of commercial real estate in the workplace today in a post-pandemic workplace, and maybe you can give us a picture of the situation currently here in the Pacific Northwest region.
Sure. I wish we were post-pandemic, but in the world in which we are in the moment, we're seeing a lot of optimism in a lot of places and a lot of pessimism in others. And let me just give it to you the landscape. So really, there's the short-term way of looking at it and the long-term way of looking at it. The short-term way of looking at it is those places where the employees feel safe and the virus is largely under control are night and day different than the places that are not that. And so I look at this through an international lens. If you take a look at what's happening in Seoul, South Korea, Sydney, and Melbourne right now, you would say it looks pretty normal. How normal? Seoul, South Korea, according to the CEO of Brookfield Properties, one of the largest owners in the world, their buildings are back to 100% occupancy in Seoul, South Korea today. I spoke to the CEO of Charter Hall in Australia the other day, and she said that her buildings in Sydney and Melbourne are back to 70%. Public transit is back to 80%. Contrast that with San Francisco, contrast that with New York, contrast that with Seattle and the Pacific Northwest and what we're talking about here, night and day different. We're seeing occupancy levels in the dense CBD areas of these markets in the 20% range. In New York, it's a 10% range, but getting better and getting better rapidly. And I'm going to leave the policy questions for Julie, but the CDC's announcement last week of reducing mask requirements had a material and immediate impact on not just the language that's being used by CEOs. I would quote Jamie Dimon last week, and Jamie was one of these guys that was all about hybrid work. He says, well, the hustlers are coming back to the office. That's a quote. So I would say that a lot of the things you're hearing from the CEOs, from the CFOs, is being said for the right reasons, to make their employees comfortable, to make them feel safe. But once they do feel safe, they're being, I wouldn't say more aggressive, but certainly more aggressively encouraging people to come back to the office. The last thing I'll mention as an introductory matter is that very difficult to reach conclusions today about how much office space is going to go hybrid. How much are we going to be 10%, 20%, 30% down? Because the data is the noisiest I've ever seen, Diane. And I know everybody on this call is very data driven. Well, let me just give you one data point. KPMG came out with a study in August of 2020. And in that study, 70% of the CEOs polled said, we're going to reduce our office space a lot, and we're going to do a lot of work from home. Fast forward to March of 2021, same CEOs polled. You know what that number turned to? 17. And the reason is this, because you can't just look at it short term. You have to look at long term. And long term, the key word you need to take into consideration is productivity. Right. And that is the word that so many people can't get to.
And sticking with productivity for a moment, I think as you just mentioned, it is a key component or key element to workforce and workplace planning. And as you said to me, we had an earlier conversation, and I thought was really interesting. You said that there's a difference between an efficient workforce and a productive workforce. How does this issue of productivity affect the discussions that you're having with companies?
Well, to quote my alma mater, Harvard Business School says that great companies focus on productivity. They don't focus on efficiency. That's a quote from one of their magazines. Okay. But the point is that productivity is very different than efficiency. Efficiency is producing the same with less resources. Productivity is producing more, better, more creative stuff with unlimited upside. Efficiency has a limit to how much benefit you can get from that. And so it is directly impacting it, Diane, because what it really comes down to is productivity is very difficult to measure for employees. Efficiency is very easy to measure. You can measure the widgets that are produced. What you can't measure is happiness. And so people use proxies for happiness, and that has to do with attracting and retaining talent. So it really comes down to the right balance that companies are going to have. Say, what can I do for my workplace that I can attract and retain the best talent? And some of it's generational, and we barbell it. So at one end of the generation are newly graduated college and MBA students. We think a disproportionate number of them are going to come back to the office. And then we have some more seasoned professionals. They're going to come back to the office more. But then you have this middle of people who have 3 kids, a dog, and a minivan like me. And I've been hybrid working for a long time, even though I'm on the road a lot. The point is that you can't just generalize about how you should put your workplace. You have to think about your target audience of A, generationally, B, what is their work function? And that will determine how much hybrid you do or not.
Yeah, and I think that that's a good transition, Julie, over to you, because, so much of this does come down to the legal and policy implications of things like the vaccine. I mean, since we're now in a place where vaccines are ubiquitous, can you help us understand a little bit about the legal and policy explanations? Can my company, as an example, require vaccines as a requirement for employment or on-premise work? Are there any recommendations or accommodations that you can give us under the law that we need to be aware of?
Sure, happy to talk about that. So there was a big change last week with the CDC's guidance in interest by employers in requiring the vaccine. Before the CDC's announcement, most employers that I've heard from were going a more conservative route, unless they had employees that needed to be in a factory or needed to be in close quarters. They weren't thinking about requiring the vaccine, but they were thinking of creative ways to encourage it. And so incentives and other programs without coming down too hard with the stick. But I have had a flood of calls since the CDC's announcement about how can we require the vaccine, with the hopes that we get everybody not only back to the office, but in an unmasked and sort of more normal atmosphere. And so far, there hasn't been any law within the United States that has said that you cannot require vaccines. There is legislation that has been introduced in a slew of states, including Washington. I haven't seen a bill in Oregon yet, but there has been legislation introduced. Most of it looks like it's going to die in committee and not get passed, but there are various laws out there being introduced that prohibit discrimination against people based on vaccination status, and that could impede the employer's ability. So my advice at this point is to sort of slow walk this until we have better guidance. All of the federal and state agencies are scrambling with the new CDC announcement, and the EEOC and OSHA are both saying they're updating their guidance for the workplace, because right now it does require masks, regardless of vaccination status. And same thing with state agencies that protect workers. They are also updating their guidance right now. So I think it's a little premature to try to roll out a new policy, but you certainly can continue to encourage your employees to be vaccinated. You can require them to be vaccinated to be in the office if they're being permitted to work from home, so they're not going to lose their employment because of the issue. And then I think it's a wait and see to look at the guidance before you roll out a plan that says everybody has to be in the office and everybody has to be vaccinated so that people will lose their jobs as a result. That's the highest risk area, obviously. So
Can you give incentives? I mean, can incentives be given for vaccinations?
yes. So the safest way is to look for a method of giving everybody the same incentive. And so there's no disability discrimination or religious discrimination if someone's not getting the vaccine because of a disability or because of a religious belief. And so that you could do things like a bonus if everybody gets to a 80% vaccinated within the workforce rate. And there is some risk to that because you don't want employees to be harassed based on their vaccination status, but that would be one way of making sure the benefit's available to everyone. Also, if you offer an extra day or two of PTO related to the vaccine, that's a justification as to why to offer it to somebody that's actually had the vaccine versus somebody that has a disability that's unable to. In all cases, when you're making rules around vaccines, you need to be careful to allow for accommodations based on disability and religious belief. You don't have to necessarily waive your requirements, but you have to go through the accommodation process to meet your legal obligations.
So, I mean, just following on that for a second, what are the best practices for ensuring, equity across this? And some of it is the soft ones like career development and advancement across employees who are, in office, hybrid, fully remote. Are there some best practices that either one of you are seeing that basically begin to address the complication of those that want this hybrid or want one way or the other that feel that their careers may be affected?
Well, I could start from another P word. I could talk about productivity all day. But the other P word, my new favorite word, is called presenteeism, which is the discrimination against people who work from home versus those who were in the office. And that was, I'm not going to go so far as to say everybody did it before the pandemic, but it was common practice before the pandemic that people in the office were treated better than people weren't. And this is not an opinion. This is based upon studies that were done right in your neck of the woods, Diane. Stanford University led this stuff. And they did studies going back to 2015 that said that people who work from home, and it's the best study I've seen from Stanford, lost their ability to network, to communicate, and to get promoted. Okay, that was a study done years ago. The other school that's at the vanguard here, and yes, I am plugging another one of my alma maters, Cornell School of Industrial Labor Relations. This is not a workplace issue. This is a labor issue. And the labor issue has to do with not just productivity from a company's perspective. Now we are in a brave new world of DE&I, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I know this because my speech 20 minutes ago was on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I can tell you just how far that ball has moved in the last year. And so I think that we are not only dealing with this new work from home thing technologically, but the DEI thing adds a very complicating wrinkle to it that quite candidly, the first time somebody gets promoted that's in the office and the person that's their peer that didn't at home, that's when this is going to be sorted out from a legal point of view.
And Julie, you agree?
Yeah, from a legal point of view, whenever you're treating people differently or they have different opportunities for promotion, you've got a risk of a discrimination claim. It's perfectly lawful if there are other unrelated to race, sex, disability factors that are going into play, but you're just putting yourself in the position where you potentially have to defend the claim if you're treating people differently. That said, I'm getting a lot of questions about employers. Can one manager require all their employees to be in the office and another manager not? Because managers have different views as to how remote works for their team. And the answer to that is yes, that's perfectly legal, but you probably are going to have an employee morale and experience issue to deal with. And you potentially could have some discrimination claims. But if it's manager by manager, it's going to be easier to defend.
Right, consistency across the total population probably makes sense. And just to put a pin in it, there was a question, so just for clarity, employers can ask employees about their vaccine status, but they can't ask for proof and they probably can't dig into the why you didn't or anything else beyond that.
So you should not dig into why you did not get vaccinated. You should, if you're inquiring on vaccine status, direct them to contact HR or some designated safety person that's trained in maintaining the confidentiality of health information.
You ask for proof?
Sorry.
Can you ask for proof?
Yeah, so you should, if you are asking, you should say, if you need an accommodation, go talk to these particular people, as opposed to what's your reason for not getting vaccinated. But then you could ask for proof, but this is going to be a state by state and local law driven issue. And all of the states are right now looking, are thinking about their guidance. And in part because there's a question whether the state, for example, in Washington, to go to a Mariners game, you're going to have to show proof of vaccination status if you want to not wear your mask. So it's a state requirement now to show proof of vaccination requirement if you want this. So my guess is what we're going to get is not only can employers require proof, but then they might need to if they're going to allow people to go maskless in the workplace. But we're just waiting for that guidance.
Is there any kind, are you edging into any areas of HIPAA in terms of how far you can go on asking?
So you should only ask, are you vaccinated or not? And you should have a reason to do that. If the person's still working remotely, no, you can't ask them if they're vaccinated just because you're curious. But if you're going to say everybody in the workplace, in the office is going to have to be vaccinated, then you can ask them, but you have to keep that confidential. You can't ask them why. And once you have the medical information, it has to be kept confidential. So it's the same thing if somebody has asked for a medical leave or a medical accommodation, it has to be kept separately. And it really shouldn't be the manager having the conversation. It should be HR or a safety person.
It sounds like it's a good explanation for why every company needs a good HR manager.
Yes.
So thank you for that. So Spencer, let's change for a minute and talk about managing leases, something that's near and dear to, I know, a lot of our portfolio companies' hearts. So you're in a hybrid workplace, you're a leaseholder, what do you need to think about in regards to less space, reconfigured space, maybe subleasing your space? What do these conversations look like?
Sure. Well, I'll give you the facts on the ground first. And the facts on the ground in Portland, in Seattle, and San Francisco aren't good, to use a technical term right now from a sublet space. There's a lot of it. That's the bad news. Here's the good news. If you look at history as a guide, sublet space tends to snap back incredibly fast once people are past the crisis. And this is certainly different than other crises, so we can debate how quickly it's going to snap back. But that's just one of the facts on the ground. But if you are a tenant in a building right now, and you're trying to determine the big question of hybrid work, that's one thing. But the other thing is, when am I going to have maximum leverage over my landlord so I can get a better deal? Which is, Diane, to put a finer point on what you're asking me, it's different market by market. And so the markets where you're going to get a better deal relative to what was the mean rent in the short term are going to be the bigger markets. It's going to be markets like San Francisco, like Los Angeles, like Chicago, like New York. The markets where you're not going to do as well are smaller markets that are growing faster, like Seattle, like Portland. I looked at Portland's demographic statistics just prior to today's call, just like you asked me to, Diane. And you know what? It's pretty encouraging. Your demographic profile is very, very strong in terms of the number of people coming to your market. So your window of opportunity in Portland is much shorter than is your window of opportunity in some of these larger markets that are going to take longer to come back to the office because of the mass transit in particular. But that's part one, is it's market by market. Number two, and here's some inside baseball on commercial real estate negotiation. You have to know the nature of your landlord, because there's going to be some landlords that are going to have much greater flexibility than others institutionally. Some institutions simply can't drop the rent because they want out of the building in 3 plus or minus years. And if you want out of your building in 3 plus or minus years, the last thing you're going to do is drop your rent because you will devalue your asset. However, if you are a family office, and there are a lot of them that own your building, and they're in it for the long haul, that's the type of landlord you can go to and say, you know what, I want X% less in my rent. I want Y% more in my TIs. You can get a better deal. Now, if you go back to that first institutional landlord who says, I'm not dropping my face rent no matter what, that's the type of landlord you can ask for more in the TI package and free rent up front.
Right. So I would imagine, though, in addition to that, the amenities that companies are asking about have changed as well. I mean, that it's no longer about the food layout and the in-office gym. It's probably more about work safety, et cetera. What kind of amenities are people asking for now?
Well, first of all, I'm drinking coffee in my house right now, and I will save at least $25 a day if I go back to the office, because that's what I've been spending at Dunkin' Donuts. But the coffee machine is not what people want. And I can do it right to our surveys. What are the top amenities that people want? And one of them goes directly to your question. The number one amenity that our big occupiers want is flex space. This is the WeWorks, the Regises, the Industriuses of the world. And they want it in their building. And so pre-pandemic, we were suggesting to our landlord clients that they couldn't go more than 20% of their building flex, or it would devalue the asset. I'm not so sure that 20% holds anymore, because there are so many occupiers. Occupiers have what's known as held vacancy. And what held vacancy is taking more space than you need. And that's typically 20 to 25% of your need, so you can grow. Now the occupiers say, hi, Mr. or Ms. Landlord, we want you to take that risk in the flex space. So flex space is number one. But numbers 2, 3, 4, and 5 are either fresh air, open air, or other forms of HVAC that make people comfortable. So one of these forms of HVAC, here's your new fancy word, is called hydronic HVAC. We have a client down in LA, McCarthy Cook, building a $500 million building in West Hollywood using this. And this is pumping hot and cold water into your floors and ceilings rather than the forced air, which most of you have. The other is open air conference rooms. So right there in your neck of the woods, if you haven't visited, had an opportunity to visit the Microsoft campus, go visit it. It is super cool, because what they have is, in addition to this cool office building, which by the way had the best cafeteria food I ever had, so food still does matter. They also have outside these little huts that are conference rooms. And so this outdoor amenity is really important in the short term. But here's one cautionary tale. So I had this conversation actually with the global head of real estate for Microsoft, Michael Ford, which is there a conflict in the short term between energy efficiency and clean air? Because guess what? For everybody on this call that wants LEED or Energy Star rating, if you have operable windows, it's a demerit. So you have to figure out how to do these outdoor amenities, have better air without sacrificing some of these other things as well.
Yeah, and hard in the buildings that are already built, and the amount of money it's going to take to retrofit them for air filtration, et cetera. And I would imagine additional janitorial services, things like this, are all being asked for as well.
Again, it goes back to short-term versus long-term, right? And so the janitorial services thing is a short-term thing. Maybe it's going to be advanced to some degree, but the long-term things are touchless technology, where you don't have to touch the elevator buttons anymore. Or other forms of separation, de-densification. And that's why I'm confident the sublet space is going to snap back faster if people don't want people to be as crowded together as they have been in the past. But ultimately, the amenities are those amenities that will make your employees feel safe, allowing them to be productive.
Yeah, that makes total sense. So Julie, then back to you on this. Any advice or counsel on the application of policy as offices start to reopen? And specifically, I'm thinking about company communication strategies. What sort of things should be addressed based on the core questions? Some of them we got to on the vaccination policy, but as employers, as CEOs begin to move forward, how should they be putting a communication strategy in place? What are you recommending that sort of covers the bases, affects them as well?
Yeah, so you can set a general expectation and communicate that. Again, it's great if it's consistent across the workforce, or at least teams, as to what the expectation is going to be as far as being in the office. But there should always be sort of a safety out, where if somebody needs an accommodation, they know who to talk about it to, because you don't want your managers making those decisions. You're going to get into disability discrimination cases and other discrimination claims. And I think that one of the things that's going to be important as we move forward is we're going to have a lot of accommodation requests, because people like working at home, and it's not that hard for somebody to go to a healthcare provider and say, for all of these reasons, it would be a lot better for me to work at home, and have that healthcare provider agree. So I think we're going to have to, be prepared to deal with a lot of accommodation requests that employers may not have gotten before. But again, setting an expectation early and then doing it early enough that your workforce has time to adjust to the new norm, as opposed to saying everybody needs to be in the office next week, so that they have time to set up childcare, things like that, is probably going to reduce the number of employees that are raising their hand and saying, I need an accommodation or I need leave, things like that, that are still going to be issues going forward.
I mean, I would imagine that you really got to look at your workforce and which functions really should be in office versus where you may have more flexibility. And there are certain jobs that just fundamentally should be in office. And I'm curious, what if you are one of those jobs? Your employer has said, I want you in office. What if an employee refuses to come back to the office? What are your options? Can you fire that employee? What can you do?
Yeah, so under the accommodation analysis, if the employee doesn't want to come back to the office because they're fearful of COVID, or they have decided to move to North Carolina and your office is in Seattle, that is their decision and you don't need to accommodate that. And you can say, well, that's the job requirement, so long. If they are saying, I need to stay home because of a disability and remote work is accommodating me, then you have to go through this interactive process with the employee. And this has always been the case under the ADA and state discrimination laws, that you have to go through this accommodation process. But before, 2 years ago, when somebody wanted to say, I want to be able to work from home, and the employer said, no, it's an essential function to be in your office, it was a lot easier for the employer to say, it's really important to be in the office. We're just not operating efficiently if we're not in the office, because everybody is stuck with the fact that we all proved we could get through it over the last year and a half. But the EEOC has been clear, it just because you had to permit this because of the COVID situation doesn't mean, and that just because we were able to get through COVID in a remote workplace, it doesn't mean that you can never argue that it's an essential function. So it's really going to be doing a good job, a better job than you would have needed to do, pre-pandemic, of documenting why really this function needs to be in the office. And it has to be something more than the manager prefers face-to-face interactions. It should be, it facilitates face-to-face interactions. We have impromptu meetings, things like that. It contributes to the whole team. It's just not a specific preference.
Right, but again, I think goes back to this issue of it's not just about so on Mondays we want the executives here, and on Tuesdays and Wednesdays, and everyone wants Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday so they can have Monday. You've really got to look at a strategy of the entire workforce holistically to put a plan in place, because if you start to say, let's, even to your point, Julie, slow walk some of this, slow walking isn't actually the issue. The issue is, what are you slow walking to? Right? I mean, where are you trying to get to versus let's see how this all works and see if everyone's happy. That could almost be more dangerous than, as the Jamie Dimon example from Spencer, ripping the Band-Aid off, putting a date out there and telling everybody what they're going to do.
Yeah, in the short term, there's going to be a higher risk to terminating people because the vaccine is only approved on an emergency basis. There's at least a couple of federal lawsuits out there. One's in New Mexico. They're not on the East Coast, but claiming that because the vaccine was approved only on an emergency basis, employers shouldn't be permitted to require it. And then there also is this legislation out there trying to protect potential against vaccine status discrimination. So in the short term, there's going to be increased risk. The other thing we see are a lot of lawsuits rolling in claiming that employers retaliated for claims of unsafe work conditions or whistleblowers. So there are a lot of workplaces that have been open this whole time because they had to be. And those employers that brought people back against their will sometimes got stuck with those employees reporting them, whether it was a legitimate violation or not. Those employees were unhappy and fearful and reporting. And I've also seen clients have issues with employees getting on social media and claiming that the workplace is unsafe and things like that. So expect your employees, if they are not making the choice to come back, to hold you to a very high standard for safety within the workplace. and one that, where they might publicize it. That's the downside.
Again, a plug for good HR manager.
Yeah.
So Spencer, someone asked the question to this new word that you've thrown out to us. Are there best practices for avoiding the pitfalls of presenteeism? How'd you say that, Spencer?
Presenteeism. And by the way, I'm probably pronouncing it wrong myself.
Yes. So are there best practices for avoiding that word? And a little bit what we were just talking about, ensuring that remote workers have the same types of opportunities in or out. And I think, Julie, you've been addressing that. But going back to the presenteeism subject, Spencer, are there best practices for avoiding it?
Well, it's a brave new world. And I think a lot of it is going to be legal as it relates to making sure you do not run afoul of DE&I, diversity, equity, and inclusion. That is going to be the driving force, I believe, of making sure that people that are in a home environment are treated the same as those that are in the office. The challenge you have is exactly as you pointed out, Diane. There's going to be some job functions have to be in the office, and it has to be consistent. And so I think that the best practice here is work with your legal and HR to be as consistent as you can. But the problem is, and I want to say it's human nature to treat people better that are in front of you. But that has been the case since the beginning of time. That because what you have are, let's assume for the moment you have functions that can be delegated to people that are at home. Well, you can't delegate the walk from the conference room to the coffee machine. You can't delegate the go to the bar downstairs after work for a drink thing. And those things have value globally. I can point to companies around the world where most business gets done not in the four walls of the office, but at a dinner or things like that. So there are really complicated issues here. But I think ultimately it's going to be a legal thing of doing the best you can from a DE&I front.
Right. So, and I agree. I think that there's a lot of unknowns here. We should probably re-meet again in about 3 months and just see what has changed since then, for sure. Curious, Spencer, we had a question here around recently the WeWork CEO was, pushing for the employees want to return to work strategy. And, we're just wondering, do we think that CEOs that do that, WeWork CEO in particular, is just trying to push people back into their real estate? From putting on your CBRE hat here, how much of that is sort of going on of let's just say that and push everybody back into the office?
Well, let me tell you a funny story. So I was on CNN last year, and 30 seconds into my interview, when I said, well, I'm more bullish about the future of office than others. And the anchor said, that's because you work for CBRE, right? It's in your best interests to bring people back into the office. And I said, well, look, I've been studying labor for 30 years, and I've been reading studies on this forever. And then I cited Enrico Moretti's studies, and I cited studies by Joel Klotkin and Richard Florida. And I go right down the list. And every study that's ever been written talks about how the collective environment called the agglomeration effect. And the agglomeration effect, that's another fancy word there next to presenteeism. Which basically is the combination of talent, infrastructure, and capital all in the same place cannot be replicated in Austin, Texas. And I'll tell you why. Now, Austin, Texas is great, but Austin, Texas, the entire Austin MSA is 2 million people. The entire MSA in New York has 30 million people. You start looking at LA and these other mega cities, and Austin's great, Nashville's great, Portland's great. Okay. I love Bend, but for the big companies, they still are going to have their headquarters disproportionately in these mega cities because of the agglomeration effect. But yeah, are people talking their book? Of course they are. You know why? Everybody does. And so but the bottom line is the research backs up the point of view of the CEO of WeWork.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And again, I think we're seeing the difference between the East Coast and the West Coast, where the financial markets are basically putting a very hard stake in the ground and saying you will come back into the office. And of course, the West Coast with the tech, it's sort of all over the place. We're never going back to this hybrid thing. Everyone should be happy in the environments that they're in.
If I could just say one thing about the tech firms, and I know that's a disproportionate number of the companies on this call and in that region, they were the leaders of wanting people in the workplace more. And that's not going to change. And why did they do that? Why did they put in the best food? Why did they put in the gyms, the ping pong tables, the ball pits? Yes, I saw conference rooms that were actually ball pits. for real, because they wanted people in the office more because they figured out they were more productive if they were. That fact doesn't change.
Yeah, no, I agree. Julie, a question around workers' comp issues. Are there, and if you've got some knowledge specifically as it relates to our region, our geography, are there worker comp issues that we should be aware of that we should be listening to and knowing about?
Yeah, so employers are always worried, what if I have people come back and they get COVID? The employee is going to have to show that they got COVID at work, which is not that easy. But if you do have a big COVID outbreak within your office, and those employees that contracted COVID don't have an explanation through other contacts, then they could likely show that they contracted at work, and then it would be covered by workers' comp, which is what you want as the employer. Is if somebody's accusing you of having gotten hurt in connection with their work, you want it to be covered by workers' comp, especially with something like COVID, which can be, it can cause death or extreme illness. You want those types of injuries not to be subject to personal injury claims, instead to be covered by workers' comp. So in general, that should cover it. It could increase your rates, but it's going to be a lot cheaper than a personal injury suit. Most state schemes, including Washington, under workers' comp, have an exception if the employee can show it was an intentional injury. So for example, it's in like chemical exposure cases and things like that, where they said the company knew that putting employees in this environment would cause the injury, and it is akin to them intentionally injuring them, and that's an exception. I think, COVID is just such an evolving issue. It would be really hard to show that, but you could, whenever you have a really severe injury or a death, there's litigation. So someone could theoretically argue this employer did such a bad job at the safety controls and knew all these people. I think with the vaccination, the likelihood of that has really become a lot less. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. No. Let's hope so. So Spencer, let's talk culture a little bit. The reality is company culture probably is a Voyager Explore session all unto itself for a multitude of reasons. But, company culture is obviously a fundamental concern of all C-level execs right now as we begin to transition back to the workplace. And in fact, of course, was a huge concern over the last year as we were all remote of how do you maintain a company culture. It's a lot of work went into Zoom cocktail parties, for company get-togethers. But there are now new challenges that are around collaboration and communication and connectedness, especially in a hybrid sort of situation. And that's key for productivity and I think, as you both have said, for wellness or happiness. So I'm thinking that culture is directly related to workplace. And to the strategy of how you manage this whole transition of workplace. I'd be really interested to your thoughts overall on, in your world, how culture and this whole workplace strategy are connected.
Well, much like the quote that I've said that great companies focus on productivity, not efficiency. I had a great boss years ago who said culture always wins in the end. And I stand behind that. And clearly the workplace is the single most tangible manifestation of your culture. Now, obviously with social media, you have websites and all that stuff too, but it still is the most tangible manifestation of it. And so that it comes back to another point we made earlier here, Diane, which is how much of your space is going to be permanent, traditional, long-term lease space, and how much of it is going to be flex space. Because the culture issue shows up not just with work from home, it also shows up from work from anywhere. If you have people working in a flex space, does that diminish your culture as well? Now, at the margins, you're going to have people who are not going to want to work for you if you insist they're in the office. And I'm not going to make a moral judgment about that, but ultimately, certain companies are going to need to have people in the workplace, functionality. Anybody who works in life sciences, it's pretty hard to take a lab home with you. But B, for this company culture thing, which is amorphous, much like productivity, we both know that it's extraordinarily important, and we both know they're both enhanced by the office.
Right. And, I mean, someone was just bringing up this issue of commuting that, now, you can put the lens on this about environmentally, we all know what happened to the air, just cleared up worldwide miraculously when there were no more cars on the road. And some cities are better for commuting than others in terms of mass transit, et cetera. I'm curious, Spencer, are you hearing commute conversations as it ties to workplace strategy and culture as well in the conversations that you guys are having with employers?
Yeah, in two ways. First of all, you take some of the high cost cities like New York, okay, and you take a look and you take into consideration their commuting. They're actually lower cost than you think overall because there's so many people who take that mass transit. So that's another thing that's going to draw people back to New York. But that's a cost issue, not a culture issue, which is what you're asking. But ultimately, the commuting does come down to two things. One is generational, which is people that will typically live in or near the workplace will be, disproportionately younger folks. The older folks will disproportionately live in the burbs. And that is that middle generation of people that have kids in school. They're going to want to commute less. I personally commute less because of that very issue. Okay, so I'm Exhibit A. But so what you're driving at, Diane, is, and I'd be remiss if I didn't mention Bend, Oregon. Well, can people commute from Bend into Portland? By the way, I love Bend, Oregon. And I can talk about
into San Francisco, they're commuting from Bend.
Okay, well, Bend is awesome. Okay, that's a very technical term. It's about as awesome of a town as you can get. But are you going to get people that are going to have formal CBD, not CBD, are their corporate headquarters there? Unless you're a beer company, and by the way, Bend is the #1 per capita beer place in the United States, literally. But the point is you will have some satellite offices there.
Yeah.
But most of those satellite offices will be in flex space, not direct space. And I know that based upon what we call in our business TIMs, tenants in market. I track tenants in market daily all over the United States. And we have not seen a spike in TIMs that wanted permanent space there. We've seen an enormous spike of TIMs that wanted to be in WeWork, Regis, or other types of flex space arrangements.
Right. Right. Yeah, no, it gets complicated, and Bend is a wonderful town, and the Californians are all moving there, and we'll see what happens with that, right? So Julie, there's a question, and we touched on this a bit about avoiding discrimination, and the discussion with employees around how to do that, and it's a little bit to the conversation that different managers may have different strategies that may be good or bad. But that also could lead to different kinds of knowledge levels around discrimination in these conversations. Other than, again, having good HR managers to provide guidance, what advice do you have in terms of the legal pitfalls of discrimination, how to not walk straight into it?
Yeah, I mean, whenever you're treating employees differently, you should have a good reason for that and be able to articulate it and be thoughtful in that. So sometimes there truly are different teams that have different needs. And for example, a sales team that's on the road all the time, they don't necessarily need to be in the, be in the office when they're not on the road because no one's there anyway. They're either in and out. Whereas a team in your marketing, your marketing team that is collaborating, has ideas and impromptu meetings, they may really need to be in the office. So you don't necessarily need to have across the entire employer rule, but you should be thoughtful when you're making, you're putting different standards on different people and communicating why, because even though you legally don't have to communicate why, if employees don't feel it's unfair and jump to the discrimination conclusion, then you're saving yourself a hassle of having to, dig yourself out of that hole. So, part of it is just being communicative, and then sometimes documenting things on the back end. And this is where a good HR person will help you. You might not necessarily document it all to the employees because you might not want to share all the reasons why one team in particular you think, so for example, if there are productivity problems, if we think several people on this team really aren't working very well at home or are very productive at home, maybe we've decided that we don't want to necessarily send a negative message to employees, but HR could document that. And then if an employee later claims this is unfair, this other team with more white people on it, or this other team that's more male, they're being allowed to work from home and we're not, then you have a non-discriminatory reason that you've got documented.
Right. I mean, again, I keep saying it because it just is coming through so loud and clear. This can't be an ad hoc strategy. This has got to be top down. This has got to be in coordination with HR and legal. This can't be manager by manager. You can't sit there and just decide as to purely on the happiness factor that everyone wants to be in office Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, not Monday, Friday, because that's not, I mean, this is really requires, in essence, in cases, maybe some tough decisions that 100% don't agree with, but that is going to work for the productivity of the business, driving culture going forward, the economics of what you're trying to get to, that this can't just be looked at as something that we ease our way into and needs to have some guidance on it. So I guess the final question, which is a little bit off kilter here, but I'm really curious, Spencer, is around, I think you've called it the snapback. So, everyone has sort of moved to their happy place of, I know on the West Coast, it's been Bend, it's been Coeur d'Alene, it's been Tahoe. They're all getting out of San Francisco. I think that's lovely. Somehow my gut says at some point here, the snapback will occur when they realize there are no museums and restaurants where they just moved to, or that in fact, it is good to be together in an office and not just sitting on Zoom. What are you seeing? What are your thoughts on that?
Sure. So shameless plug, CBRE just did a study on that, and we used a couple of different sources. We used the U.S. Postal Service, people changing their mailing address. We used LinkedIn, people changing their profile, Google mobility. So there's all kinds of data we used for this opinion that I'm about to give you, which is there are certain elements of this that was an acceleration of pre-existing trends. And the pre-existing trends were the movement from California to Phoenix, from New York to Nashville, to Florida, to Raleigh, those places. That was happening pre-COVID, and some element of that clearly accelerated. But the snapback, the rubber band effect, we think is going to be more significant because not necessarily from the big moves to Nashville, but the move to the suburbs of some of these cities. Those people are still going to either A, work in the CBD, or B, go back there. And what is another data point I can give you? Self-storage. It's one of these subcategories of commercial real estate. Had a tremendous year in 2020. Why? People stuck their stuff in storage so they can go get it when they go back out of their parents' houses. And so multifamily is already snapped back in many of these major markets. Had the best December or January ever. So we think the rubber band snapback effect will be done not as much by employers encouraging or going beyond that, the employees. They're going to realize that if I want to get the kind of culture environment I want, which is not just in the four walls of the office, but the overall market, that's why people are going to come back, disproportionately younger folks. And then you have this generational thing. So one of the great brokers at my company, she may be the greatest broker in the history of the world, frankly, is Marianne Ty. And Marianne said, what is the number one amenity in New York? New York. Same thing with San Francisco.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, listen, guys, this has been great for me. Is there any final words that you'd like to tell our fantastic early stage entrepreneurs who are struggling with figuring this out? Are there any final words of wisdom that you'd like to give them to both execute well, stay out of trouble, and keep their companies on track as they begin to transition? Julie, any thoughts?
So just from having a few conversations with leaders who have a little bit stepped in the muck, my advice is be careful around conversations on vaccines and health issues, especially as a high level person within the organization who's a decision maker. If you can push those conversations to HR or someone designated, you're much better not having gotten into that. And right now, everybody's talking about vaccines. We can't help it. But as with any medical information, employees can volunteer any information that they want, but that doesn't mean that their employer can ask them questions after they've volunteered. So be careful about the conversations, just to keep both you and the organization out of hot water, and try to have somebody that has a little more training and is a little more removed from promotion, and other decisions involved in those conversations.
And it sounds like if you're a CEO, if you're one of the CEOs sitting here listening to this, make sure your entire organization, your entire management team is educated on this as well, that you really have a little bit of right now upfront education to do, just like this conversation today, as to the rights and wrongs in the organization. Spencer, final words?
So the last thing I would say is look at your real estate as a holistic decision, not a cost-based decision. So in less expensive markets, your real estate is typically 3 or 4% of your top line. In more expensive markets like San Francisco, New York, it might be 9 or 10, but there's a reason for that, because there are studies that we have done that show that even though you're seeing a net outflow of people on the aggregate basis from some of these big markets, you're still going to see a net inflow of the most highly educated people, most highly productive people into those markets. So I'm not saying you get what you pay for, but I am saying that there's a reason why these markets are expensive. It attracts and retains the highest quality talent.
Yeah, that makes total sense as well. And of course, go CBRE as your real estate guidance.
I'm not going to make a shameless plug, but I will make a shameless plug for the Weekly Take podcast that I host. So please listen to the Weekly Take podcast, the #1 podcast in commercial real estate.
Go for it. Go for it. Guys, thank you so very much. Spencer, Julie, this has been great. I'm sure it's been informative for all of our audience. And on behalf of Voyager and yet another Voyager Explore conversation, I thank you all for participating. If you've got any further questions, we'd be happy to put you in contact with either Spencer or Julie, but really more importantly, make sure that you've got a good relationship going with your own personal legal and HR and your CBRE representative. And with that, I will say thank you and goodbye.